Welcome to the Authentic Self Revolution. I'm Carly, your guide on this journey to genuine living and the real wealth of freedom and fulfillment. In a world that just loves to tell us who we should be, we're here to remember who we truly are. We're here for the questioners, the misfits, and anyone who's ever felt there must be more to life than following the script. Together, we'll explore what it means to revolutionize your life by living it on your terms. Each week, we peel back the layers of shoulds and musts, dive into practical ways to live more authentically, and uncover the beautifully simple truths at the heart of personal growth. If you're listening only and want to see my face, you can head over to my YouTube channel, Owning Authenticity, where you'll find this podcast along with a literal treasure trove of other content aimed at uncovering who you truly are. Your authentic self is waiting, so let's dive in. In today's episode, we are continuing this trend of getting to the heart of what stops us from being our most authentic self, right? And so today we are covering 3 tips, including practical exercises for embracing imperfection and overcoming the fear of getting it wrong. Raise your hand out in the world if this is something that you personally struggle with. My inner perfectionist used to run the ship, used to be steering the ship and be the final say on whether or not something was approved to share with anyone else. And that meant that I shared basically nothing with anyone else. And that went against my core values. Right? Like part of what I'm here to do is to share, is to create, is to inspire and uplift and bring joy and all kinds of beautiful things to the planet. And if I'm never sharing anything, I'm not doing any of that. Right? So this one is especially important to take a look at if your core values have you inspired to bring your magic to anyone else. This is a big one to work on chipping away at. And you may have already noticed a theme with these episodes as far as the authentic self revolution and being your authentic self, who you were born to be. So far, we have spent very little time talking about how to know who your authentic self is. We've spent almost all the time talking about how to get out of your own way. And just take a second and let that sink in, because there's a very real reason that we're approaching it this way, because in my experience, it isn't about knowing who you are. You know who you are. There's just so many layers and layers and layers and layers on top of that about who we think we should be and how we think we have to show up in order to let ourselves show up. So if we can start chipping away, if we can dissolve one little bit of those layers a week, and then next week and next week and next week, a little bit more. If we can systematically remove the things that are standing in your way, being your authentic self is the most natural thing in the world. So today we are diving in a little bit deeper, focusing on imperfection, the perfectionism that might live inside of you, especially if you come from a childhood that had very high standards, that had very specific standards about how you needed to be and what was acceptable and what was unacceptable. And these kinds of high standards can be internally taken in and turned into this inner perfectionist that still lives with you to this day, maybe even decades later. So all of that boiling down to this fear of getting it wrong, and really even this inner debate of the right versus wrong way to do it, to show up, to create the thing, to say the thing, even spending energy going back and forth in your mind trying to figure out what is the right way. These are all ways to recognize that this episode is going to be especially juicy for you. So as we dive in, I've got 3 tips for you to embrace imperfection and overcome the fear of getting it wrong. Each tip, just as we go through, maybe have a journal, a pen, even just in your mind, be thinking about which of these is most at work in your life, as far as what we talked about with standing in your way of letting your authentic self naturally flow forward. And each of these tips is coming with a practical exercise that you could take in and work with for the next week, the next month, and feel the results of that, right? Being more authentic, healing ourselves, and releasing our imperfection, our fear of imperfection and getting it wrong. These are not things that we just think about. Right? We can just think about them, but that's not going to have very much payoff in actually changing the way we show up and changing what's going on inside of our inner world. On the converse side of that, though, when we will actively engage with these patterns, when we will actively do the reps in the authenticity gym with these exercises or exercises like this, maybe one of these inspires you to try something that you hadn't thought of before. Whatever you will do to take action to put one pinky toe outside the comfort zone that you normally operate inside of, that is how we chip away at these patterns of holding ourselves back and letting our authentic self more come online onto the surface of our lives. So this first one is so good and could probably be the end of the episode. But fortunately for you and me and everybody else, we've got 2 more after this. So the first tip is redefining success. All right. And I would even go up a layer more meta perspective and really even just contemplate, what does success mean? What does failure mean? Like in this whole inner debate of, am I getting it right or am I getting it wrong? What does that even mean? What is right? What is wrong? What is success? What is failure? What does that mean? And in this whole pursuit of authentic living, it's even more important to ask, what does it mean to you? Right? Because you are the one held back by your idea of getting it wrong. And so what does getting it wrong even mean? And this is where redefining success is huge, is a huge transformational turning point if this is something that's resonating with you. And redefine it to what? That is, again, I think, an opportunity for a burst of authenticity to come through, for you to personalize your definition of success and what it means to you. And I would suggest, and these are coming out of the work that I've done on this and continue to do on this, every time my perfectionist rears its head up, that's an opportunity to redefine my definition of success a little bit more. And for me, success looks like learning, growing, and increasing my well-being, right? And if we think about it, diminishing my inner perfectionist is increasing my well-being. So the more I can soothe those thoughts of perfectionism, I'm being successful. And at that point, that might blow your mind a little bit, because that means that the outcome of the thing you're actually working on is irrelevant. Right? So another way to say this is shifting your focus from the outcome of what it is that you're trying to create or share or produce or whatever. Shift your focus from the outcome to the process, the learning that's happening, the growth that's happening, the increased well-being and authenticity that's happening. And when we redefine success in this way, we remove the pressure of getting everything right. And when we remove that pressure, we open ourselves up to the new experiences and insights that are already right there, that are always right there, that are lurking just on the periphery and are often missed because we are so focused on getting it right. This bullseye in the center of the target, that the target isn't even real. When we start to really question and go deeper into what does getting it right even mean? And one example of this is when we think about giving a presentation, Okay. And that might be like showing up on a podcast. That might be doing a presentation at work. That might be hosting a training session on some topic that you're into. Whatever the case is, like when we think about showing up in front of other people, often this can be a really sore space for where this perfectionism and getting it right and doing well like can really rear its head up. And so this is a golden opportunity to work with, what does getting it right really mean? And again, speaking from my own personal experience, getting it right for me in terms of showing up in front of others means being present with the moment, being able to connect with the people that I'm there with in terms of my common humanity touching their common humanity, right? Like it's not about showing up as the perfect golden statue of the standard of what it means to be human. It's about whatever you think it's about. Like, why are you there in the first place? You know, and in my world and with the work that I've done around this and continue to do around this, I want to give myself as many permission slips as I need to show up authentically, because I believe in and value the ripple effect of what happens when I do that. The more I give myself permission to do that, the more other people have at least the open space to consider doing the same. Right? I can't sign anybody else's permission slip. I can't pour into anybody else's cup. But the more that I do that for myself, the more likely it is that I'll have that kind of influence and impact on other people. So this one comes with this exercise, the growth mindset journal. And growth mindset is something that gets thrown around a lot, and for good reason. For good reason. It is literally the antidote to perfectionism. All right. So like, again, if you took nothing else out of this episode, this one right here would be an awesome one to work with. Maybe though you've already done a shit ton of work on your growth mindset and you're like, yeah, I feel pretty good about that. In which case, the next tip and the next exercise is going to be really juicy for you. But as a place to start, or maybe even take it to the next level, the growth mindset journal, basically step one, every day for a week. Again, you could do this for 2 weeks or 30 days or however long you're willing to roll up your sleeves and do the work to move past perfectionism. But every day, identify one thing that didn't go as planned. Shouldn't be too difficult. Step two, write down 3 things that you learned from this experience, right? So take the focus off of the outcome of it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Okay, that's fine. That's life, right? Like most of us, 99.99999% don't see the future. All right. So like the fact that it didn't go as planned, okay, that seems like par for the course. So what did you learn? Look into the process of what happened. What insight did you get? What learning did you get? What growth did you get? And then step 3, reflect on how you can apply these things in the future, right? Like I hate to get too much into this. We're going to spend several episodes in the future on this, but basically there's so much interconnection between the areas of our life where like something at work didn't go as planned and you learned XYZ, and then you can come home and actually apply XYZ in your relationship. Right? Something in your creative project didn't go as planned and you learned ABC, and then you can go to work and apply ABC and get better outcomes at work. So like when we say the term happy accident, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the things we learn in this domain of life that can actually serve us and possibly even be the exact answer to a problem we're facing in this other domain of life. Happy accident. Aren't you glad that that thing didn't go as planned? So how can you apply these things? How can you leverage what you're learning in your life? And I would say every single day, every single thing you learned, celebrate that, because that right there is success. You are figuring out how to apply that thing, celebrate harder, because that's bigger success, right? Like, it didn't go as planned, I failed. Take that off the table. It's not real, right? Depending on how you define success. And at the end of the week, at the end of the month, review these entries and look at how far you came in terms of shrinking your inner critic, your inner perfectionist, and growing your inner cheerleader, the part of you that knows that no matter what the outcome is, you're winning. When you're learning, you're winning. When you're learning, you're succeeding. Period. If you decide that's how you want it to be. Only if you want it to be that way. Number 2, and this is for if you've done quite a lot of work on your growth mindset, if you've positioned success as a learning experience, right? When you're learning, you're winning, then you're ready for tip number 2, which is to embrace the first draft mentality, aka do it messy. Right? Like perfectionism would have you keep it in your head until you know that it's so perfect. It's just exactly the way I want it to be. And then you can do the thing. Then you can write the book. Then you can make the webinar. Then you can write your stand-up comedy routine. Like whatever it is, do it messy. Make a first draft. This approach changes the task from creating the perfect outcome to just start. Like how many creative endeavors die inside our mind because we don't ever even start them. And in that way, like we don't ever even really let ourselves try. And so this one of doing it messy, it's like just attempt the first draft. All right. And like go into it knowing that nobody else is ever going to see this. Just put some things on paper. Do it as fast as you can. And don't edit while you're doing it. Know that when you've done the first draft, then you can come back. You can sleep on it a day or two and then come back and look at it and say, oh, wow, like this part is actually really good. This next part, yeah, I would reword it like this, and this. Okay, great. Now you got a second draft. Fantastic. Show it to a friend. Maybe they got some thoughts about like, this part is actually really awesome. I love that. I wish it was longer. I wish there was more to it. Great. Okay, put some more in there. Now you're cooking with gas, right? Like now you've actually got the burner turned on under the water you're trying to boil. You've actually got a physical, tangible creation in the works that you can grow and develop and evolve and learn from. Right? So this idea of doing it messy will revolutionize your creative process if you're open to it. And that first draft mentality, again, it's about taking the pressure off, getting things perfect the first time, because is that even freaking possible? Maybe you think it is, and that is a paralyzing belief. Just be honest with you. And I'm speaking from experience. So rather than believing that it has to be perfect the first time, the first draft mentality is encouraging experimentation and authenticity. Because when you actually let yourself do it, you are using a different part of the brain than the imagination of doing the thing. When you actually take the imagination and force it out of your body, through your hands, through your voice, you're engaging different parts of the brain. And what does that mean? That means you're bringing more of your whole self online, and chances are you can do a better job in real life than you can imagine in your brain. So that is, again, revolutionary in terms of what it is that you're allowed to create. And in terms of like putting my money where my mouth is, I want to share a very vulnerable feeling story about, this podcast. And being ready to launch a podcast called The Authentic Self Revolution and do episode after episode after episode of what does it mean to be authentic and to live in an authentic way. And that to me feels like the edge of where I'm at in my own journey of my authentic self. And how did I get here? Right? Like these episodes, this is, yes, doing it messy, but at the same time, my messy version is not near what it used to be, considering that at the very beginning of my podcast journey 3 years ago, I had 2 different podcast projects that never got off the ground. All right, one with one friend that we were going to collaborate and do a podcast, and we recorded 1 episode and the whole thing blew up. Another with another friend that we were going to do a different podcast, and we recorded 1 episode and the whole thing blew up. And then I launched my first podcast where it was just me, and I did over 100 episodes on that podcast. I launched a second podcast. That one has probably 30 episodes on it. I launched a third podcast that has about 15 episodes on it. I launched a fourth podcast that has about 30 episodes on it. Meanwhile, I also launched 2 different YouTube channels that combined have over 800 videos on them. And then I launched this podcast. Okay, so do it messy, do it messy, do it messy, do it messy, and I'm still doing it messy. And my messy version is a lot more polished than my messy version would have been 3 years ago. And just to really, really help demonstrate progress over perfection, I've linked the first episode of my very first podcast in the description box. It's called Go For It. It fits so perfectly right here with Do It Messy. And you should take a listen to it, because that chick 3 years ago, she could barely breathe. All right. And she had a vulnerability hangover almost immediately after doing that podcast. And because of her, I'm here now. Right? Like if I had waited until I had proficiency with podcasting to become a podcaster, I never would have done it. And that's heartbreaking, because that's where a lot of people's dreams begin and end. Is I'm not good enough for this. Perfectionism. I don't know how to do it right. Fear of getting it wrong. So do it messy. Let yourself identify. So this is the exercise. Do it messy challenge. Step number 1, identify a task or project that you've been putting it off due to fear of getting it wrong. All right. Think about, like, what would you do if you knew that you couldn't get it wrong? What's on that list? What's the first thing that pops to mind? What's the second thing that pops to mind? Pick one of those. And I would say, like, we talked about on the last one, like the authenticity ladder, like pick one that's like relatively low on the ladder that you can reach. It's outside your comfort zone, but it's pretty close. Not something that's all the way up there that like is totally out of reach. Like set yourself up for success and being able to do the thing, because doing the thing is where your confidence will get built and will grow. So step number 1 is identify that task. Step number 2 is set a timer for 20 minutes and work on the task. Focus on progress, not perfection. Do it messy. Maybe that means that instead of like writing the book or writing the chapter, write an outline, write some bullet points, write some fragments, write a list of the characters and, who they really are at their core and who they present themselves to be on the surface. It doesn't have to be the full-blown thing. Just set the timer for 20 minutes and work on it. Because the thing about flow state is that once you get in the stream of creation, more will come and more will come and more will come. And again, the fear of getting it wrong, it's like you set yourself up with needing to see the full 100-mile journey and like turn by turn and stop by stop and like show me the entire journey. Let me plan for every single eventuality on this journey, and then I'll take the first step. And the truth is, when you'll take the first step, the next stepping stone is right there waiting for you and easy to see, and put your foot on it. And once you put your foot out for the next step, the next stepping stone is right there. So letting yourself get into the progress and the process of creating the thing will give you the fuel and the inspiration for the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step. But when we refuse to start because what if I get it wrong? Yeah, it just, again, it's paralyzing. And step number 3, when the timer goes off, reflect on what you've accomplished and how it feels to take imperfect action. Are there pieces of your creation that you're like pleasantly surprised by? Are there pieces that as you sit back and look at it, you're like, well, yeah, this gap right here, like I would need to fill that in. Of course, like creativity is often not linear. It's the part that's most accessible. Create that. And once you stand back and look at it, then you're like, oh yeah, and I want to make this thing. Great, create that. And as you stand back and look at it, it's like, oh, and I want to make this thing that ties these two pieces together. Great, create that. set another 20-minute timer, and keep messily creating the first draft of each of these pieces. And as the picture starts to come together, that's when you can really stand back and look at it and start to refine what it is that you've made. And all of this in the privacy of your own creative space, right? And then step number 4, and this is really where like you've got some authenticity muscles built up to do step number 4, is share your messy progress. Show it to a friend. Get really brave and get on social media and celebrate that you started the thing that you have been putting off, and you overcame the fear and took the first step. Right? And if you want to contribute to this conversation, you can add hashtag authentic self revolution, because taking that first step is the hardest one. That's the hardest part. So especially, and like we talked about in the last one, celebrate that you did the thing, that you gave yourself permission to actually show up. And tip number 3, so last tip for this episode, is practice self-compassion in the face of mistakes. And if you've been listening to these episodes along the way, you know that that was also a tip for handling the fear of rejection. Practicing self-compassion. And that is essentially just where you treat yourself with kindness and understanding when you make a mistake or face a setback. And this is also where I'm going to loop 1 and 3 together and ask you, what is a mistake? What does that mean? And the more you're held back by the fear of making a mistake, the fear of getting it wrong, the more payoff is in spending some time, maybe doing a little bit of journaling around what even is a mistake. What does that mean? What does it mean to make a mistake? And again, often when I do this questioning and inquiry with clients, when we dig down into what does it mean to make a mistake, it's like, well, it didn't end up how I thought it was going to. And at that point, you're telling me that you can't see the future, which lumps you in with 99.99999% of the population of the planet, right? I couldn't predict the outcome, and that's a mistake. That doesn't actually make logical sense, right? Like, we don't get to predict the outcome. That's why it's important to not focus on the outcome and to just start creating and let the outcome shape itself like a sculpture that maybe you have a picture in your mind, but when you actually get into creating the physical thing in the 3D, it's most likely going to be even better in some ways than what you could have imagined. And it'll be pretty different from your original vision in other ways, because when you actually create in the 3D, you're dealing with the laws of physics, all kinds of things that don't exist in our imagination, right? Bringing something to life in the physical is very different than imagining it inside of our head where we're just in dream mode, which is a beautiful thing to do, to fantasize about what you want to create, but at the same time, let yourself have some leeway to really let whatever it is that's wanting to come through your creative process come through. And again, when we embrace self-compassion, that's reducing the fear of getting things wrong. And how do we do that? We create a safe internal environment. All right, so really what we're talking about here is giving our inner critic a dose of chill. All right, our inner critic can be the hardest barrier to our creative process. So much worse than, like, again, like the last episode, like we're afraid of what other people will think. We're afraid of what we will think. You know, like that do it messy challenge. It's like there's so much of that work that involves only you seeing it. Making a first draft that only you're going to look at has nothing to do with what anybody else will think. It only has to do with what you think and the level of your inner critic compared to the level of your inner cheerleader. And practicing self-compassion is amplifying the inner cheerleader, is encouraging you by saying, like, you made a draft. You've been talking about that book, that thing, that creation for 20 years. and you made a draft. Hell yeah. Dude, that's amazing. That is incredible. Way to go. Way to go. Like, way to give your editor a job, right? Most of us keep our editor on the bench for the rest of our lives because we aren't even willing to make a first draft that the editor can look at, because we're so caught up in the idea of it needing to be perfect right off the bat. And so the exercise here is very similar to the last episode as far as that self-compassion mirror talk, where each morning you stand in front of a mirror, look into your eyes, look at the human being standing there, think of a recent mistake, big air quotes, or imperfection, and say out loud, it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. They're part of being human. A mistake is human. Not being able to see the future and predict the outcome exactly, that's human, right? So like self-compassion, embracing our common humanity, say to yourself, I forgive myself for being human. I'm learning and I'm growing. I'm worthy and valuable regardless of my perceived imperfections, right? Like they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So is imperfection. Imperfection is in the eye of the beholder. Your inner critic is calling something imperfect, but that is just the inner critic's opinion. I would be like, okay, thank you. I appreciate your input. Inner cheerleader, what's your opinion? Let's get some balance going up in here, right? And so throughout the day, as you notice self-criticism, pause and repeat these compassionate statements. I forgive myself for being human, right? What a concept. I am human, might as well accept it. Just a thought. And really the key to this one and cultivating self-compassion is to even notice when self-criticism is happening, because the thing about it is that negative self-talk, that voice of the inner critic, can be so deeply internalized, meaning it's so normal, we don't even hear it. We don't even really realize how hard we're being on ourselves all day, every day. How mean we're being to ourselves. And why? Because it's normal. So recognizing what you're saying to yourself, recognizing that inner self-talk, and all day, every day, asking yourself, would you say that to the person you love most in the world? Would you say that to a child? Would you say that to your best friend, to your beloved? Would you? And if the answer is no, thank you for your input. Inner cheerleader, what would you say in this situation? And at that point, you get to decide, because you're not the inner critic, you're not the inner cheerleader, you're the observer who is taking note of what the inner critic is saying and who is taking note of what the inner cheerleader is saying, and then is using all of that data to make a decision about how to proceed. Do I continue beating up on myself? Do I let myself off the hook? Do I try again? Do I edit my first draft? Do I do it messy and just make a first draft in the first place? Right? You are the observer of all of the inner parts of you that gets to decide how you actually want to navigate. And that is the beautiful opening that lets your authentic self flow through and come online into the surface of your life. So as we think about embracing imperfection and overcoming the fear of getting it wrong, this is also a one step at a time process. And maybe you've already done a lot of work in this arena. And so I would say go to the edge of what you're ready for next and pick the tip, pick the strategy, pick the exercise, or maybe this caused you to think of a different way to practice. Pick that and work with it for the next week and observe the impact of just switching even 1 degree, making that 1 degree turn, and then celebrating any growth along the way, celebrating any little bit more authenticity that's able to trickle out into your life as a result of getting out of your own way. So to recap, those 3 tips were redefine success, embrace the first draft mentality, and practice self-compassion. Which of these is best suited to where you are at this stage in your authentic journey? Only you can know that, right? Even choosing which way to practice releasing your authentic self is an act of authenticity. So I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these resonated most with where you are right now? What epiphany, what insight, what aha moment did you have as you were contemplating this journey of embracing imperfection? Remember, it is a journey. It is not a destination. So remember to be patient and persist when we're working in this arena of authentic living. It's something that we get a little bit better at, a little bit better at, a little bit better at when we are willing to keep practicing. I thank you so much for being here. I would love to hear about your experiences if you want to share on social media using the hashtag Authentic Self Revolution. And because self-compassion just keeps popping up in all of these strategies, the next episode, we're going to talk about 4 ways to cultivate self-compassion on your authenticity journey. It is absolutely a key ingredient to letting yourself shine a little bit brighter week after week, month after month, year after year. And if you are ready to dive in even deeper, you are more than welcome. Super excited to welcome you into an authenticity activation session where you and I can have a one-on-one conversation on Zoom to talk about what is it that you really want, to look at what barriers and blocks and stories and limiting beliefs might be standing in your way, might be holding you back, and what are your unique gifts and what does the next step look like as far as how to own those more fully. So you can book that session for yourself anytime. This is an open invitation by visiting owningauthenticity.com/activate. Until next time, I do hope that you are taking such good care of the real you, and so will I.